At dawn, beneath fresh snow beside a Delaware County road, a gloved hand brushed frost from an abandoned sedan's window, revealing condensation trapped inside. A silent clock stopped midwinter, while investigators sensed something unfinished waiting beyond the glass, measured breaths fogging the air as evidence lay still. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The car had been reported hours earlier by a municipal plow driver who noticed it angled oddly against a snowbank outside the town of Milford, Delaware, its hazard lights dark, its tires half buried by overnight accumulation. The scene felt ordinary to residents accustomed to winter breakdowns, yet the responding deputy noted small details that shifted the tone immediately. The keys were not in the ignition. The driver's door was unlocked. A light dusting of snow lay undisturbed on the hood, suggesting the vehicle had been stationary for days, not hours. Inside, a purse rested on the passenger seat, its contents intact, wallet present, identification belonging to 22-year-old Emily Harper, a local college student home for the holidays. The date was January 3, 1988, the morning after a heavy coastal snowstorm, and the town was still quiet from New Year's celebrations that had ended under falling flakes. Emily Harper had last been seen on December 30, 1987, after leaving a late afternoon shift at a family-owned pharmacy near the Green Hill area. She told coworkers she planned to drive home, pack for a short New Year's visit with friends in Wilmington, and return before classes resumed. When she did not arrive and failed to call, concern grew slowly, dulled by the holiday season when routines often blur. Her parents filed a missing person report on January 1, when New Year's Day passed without contact. By then, a thin layer of snow had already covered much of the county, obscuring footprints, tire impressions, and fragile clues that winter erases without hesitation. Law enforcement began with methodical steps, canvassing the route between the pharmacy and Emily's family home, a familiar stretch of Route 113 lined with pine stands, frozen fields, and scattered diners closed for the holiday. The abandoned sedan was found several miles off her expected path, down a lightly traveled service road near a drainage area feeding the Municipal River. The location suggested either confusion or deliberate deviation. Officers photographed the vehicle, documented the interior, and secured it for processing once a tow could reach the site. There were no signs of forced entry, no visible blood, no immediate indicators of violence. The absence itself carried weight. As the day progressed, state police detectives joined the investigation. They reviewed Emily's recent activities, credit card usage, and phone records, noting nothing unusual beyond routine holiday purchases. Interviews with friends painted a consistent picture: responsible, cautious, not prone to spontaneous detours or risky behavior. Weather reports confirmed that on December 30, temperatures had dropped sharply after sunset, with light snow beginning overnight. Any mechanical issue would have made stopping dangerous, yet Emily was known to maintain her car carefully. The possibility of her accepting help from a passerby was considered, though friends said she was wary of strangers, a habit shaped by widely publicized crimes of the era. By January 5, search teams expanded efforts along wooded edges and waterways near the car's location. Volunteers from the community joined law enforcement, forming lines across frozen ground, their breath visible, boots crunching through snow crust. Local newspapers reported the search with restrained language, emphasizing cooperation and hope. Flyers bearing Emily's photograph were posted in grocery stores, post offices, and the courthouse lobby, their edges curling in the dry winter air. For older residents, the imagery recalled other missing person cases from decades earlier, moments when towns waited together for answers that sometimes never came. On January 8, 3 days into the expanded search, a state trooper noticed disturbed brush near a culvert roughly half a mile from where the sedan was found. Beneath accumulated snow, the ground showed subtle depressions inconsistent with animal movement. Investigators halted volunteer activity and secured the area. Careful excavation revealed Emily Harper's body concealed among reeds and frozen mud, positioned in a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than accident. There were no overt signs of trauma visible through winter clothing, and the scene was treated with meticulous care. Photographs, measurements, and soil samples were collected before transport to the state medical examiner's office in Dover. The autopsy, conducted the following day, reflected the limitations of the time. The medical examiner noted exposure-related findings consistent with winter conditions, alongside subtle indicators of asphyxiation. There were no defensive wounds documented, no clear evidence of sexual assault, and toxicology later returned negative. The cause of death was ruled homicide by asphyxiation, with manner undetermined due to lack of specific injury markers. The report underscored the possibility of pressure applied to the airway without leaving lasting skeletal damage, a scenario known to forensic pathologists, but difficult to prove conclusively in 1988. The investigation faced immediate challenges. Without witnesses, without a murder weapon, and without biological evidence preserved to modern standards, detectives relied on timelines and opportunity. Emily's car showed no mechanical failure. Gas level was adequate. Weather alone could not explain her presence on the service road. Investigators theorized she may have been followed or flagged down. They examined reports of other incidents along Route 113, including minor assaults and suspicious encounters, but no clear pattern emerged. Attention turned to individuals known to travel the area regularly: delivery drivers, seasonal laborers, and local residents with prior offenses. Interviews were conducted patiently, sometimes repeatedly, as memories faded and hardened into routine denial. One name surfaced early but lacked corroboration. A 34-year-old maintenance worker named Thomas Reed had been questioned after a coworker mentioned he often drove service roads to avoid traffic. Reed denied any contact with Emily and provided an alibi placing him home on December 30. Without evidence to contradict him, detectives documented the interview and moved on. By spring, the case slowed. Snow melted, erasing the physical landscape that had shaped early theories. Media coverage diminished, replaced by new stories. Emily Harper's parents attended every meeting offered, reviewing reports, asking measured questions, learning the language of investigation out of necessity. The case file grew thick with notes, maps, and typed statements, then settled into the shelves of the Delaware State Police Cold Case Archive, where it would remain for decades, revisited periodically but unresolved. Through the remainder of 1988, detectives revisited Emily Harper's final movements with deliberate restraint, understanding that time erodes certainty. They reconstructed December 30th minute by minute, verifying receipts, phone logs, and winter road conditions. The service road's isolation suggested familiarity. Maps showed it connected to agricultural access points used by maintenance crews. Patrol logs confirmed limited traffic after dusk. Investigators requested vehicle registrations for residents with similar routes, building a list that grew unwieldy. Each name required interviews, background checks, and elimination. The process favored patience over speculation. Senior officers reminded younger staff that cold cases are not solved by intuition, but by records that endure. Emily's file expanded with photographs of snowbound ditches, photocopies of maintenance schedules, and summaries of interviews that yielded little yet preserved a factual spine for future review. Those materials would later guide renewed analysis when technology and perspective finally aligned with patience intact alone. Throughout 1989 and the early 1990s, the investigation shifted toward behavioral analysis. Without physical evidence, detectives assessed patterns of opportunistic crime along rural corridors. They reviewed similar cases in neighboring states, noting seasonal vulnerabilities around holidays when travel increases and routines change. Thanksgiving and New Year periods appeared repeatedly, linked to darkness, cold, and reduced witnesses, yet no matching suspect emerged. Interviews with motorists and property owners near the service road produced recollections colored by time. Snowstorms blurred memories. Vehicles became generic. Faces lost definition. The case demanded documentation rather than belief. Evidence custodians ensured items were preserved, though standards then lacked modern foresight. Clothing, soil samples, and vehicle swabs were stored carefully, tagged, and cataloged, awaiting methods not yet available to extract their silent information. Administrators approved periodic reviews, keeping the file active and reminding families that the search, though quiet, continued beyond seasons and shifting public attention. In 1996, Delaware State Police established a formal cold case unit, consolidating dormant investigations into a centralized archive. Emily Harper's case was transferred with meticulous inventory. Detectives unfamiliar with the original terrain reviewed photographs, reports, and autopsy findings. Advances in forensic science prompted cautious optimism. Items previously unsuitable for testing were re-examined. However, early DNA techniques required clear biological material, which the evidence lacked. The sedan's interior yielded no usable profiles. Soil comparisons confirmed only the recovery site. Still, the review clarified timelines and narrowed plausible scenarios. Emily likely encountered someone she recognized or felt compelled to trust briefly. The absence of struggle suggested surprise and control rather than prolonged confrontation, conclusions documented carefully to avoid conjecture. Supervisors emphasized restraint, ensuring conclusions remained grounded in documented facts, preserving credibility for eventual court scrutiny and community confidence during renewed efforts decades later when witnesses resurfaced unexpectedly under improved investigative coordination statewide. Community memory of Emily Harper persisted quietly. Her parents maintained contact with investigators, marking anniversaries with letters rather than protests. Local journalists occasionally revisited the story, framing it within broader discussions of unresolved violence against young women during the late 20th century. For older readers, the case resonated with national shifts toward accountability and forensic rigor. Each article renewed tips, most unhelpful, some sincere. Detectives logged every call. The courthouse basement stored boxes of transcripts and microfilm, cold rooms humming steadily. Winters returned year after year, snow lining the same roads where Emily vanished, reinforcing the unresolved nature of the loss within the town's collective awareness. As decades passed, institutional memory became the case's greatest asset, preserving detail beyond personal recollection and preventing erosion of accountability across successive administrations who inherited files, procedures, and responsibilities, without the bias of original involvement allowing fresh review grounded in evidence and documented timelines. In 2009, a comprehensive audit of cold cases coincided with improved DNA amplification methods. Analysts reprocessed preserved items using touch DNA techniques unavailable decades earlier. A partial profile emerged from the sedan's steering wheel, incomplete yet promising. It did not match Emily Harper, The profile was male, unknown, and entered into national databases. For years, it yielded nothing. Investigators documented the result. Understanding database growth is gradual. The case remained open, buoyed by the first tangible lead since 1988. Procedures were updated, contact lists refreshed. Detectives prepared for the long interval between scientific progress and practical identification. This development reframed priorities, shifting emphasis from speculation toward patient comparison, while maintaining transparency with the family and local authorities, awaiting lawful confirmation through periodic briefings, written summaries, and assurances that progress would not compromise evidentiary integrity during eventual prosecutorial review under contemporary standards with oversight, documentation, and interagency coordination maintained throughout re-examination. Database expansion eventually intersected with routine law enforcement submissions. In 2016, the partial profile returned a tentative familial association, flagged cautiously. Analysts identified similarities to a profile from an unrelated misdemeanor case processed years earlier. The individual was Thomas Reed, now in his early 60s, residing out of state. The match was not definitive, requiring additional evidence. Investigators revisited Reed's 1988 interview, noting inconsistencies previously deemed inconclusive. Employment records placed him working maintenance routes near Milford that winter. Service road familiarity resurfaced as relevant. Detectives sought legal authorization for covert collection to confirm identity without alerting the subject prematurely. Surveillance planning adhered strictly to constitutional limits, coordinating with prosecutors to ensure admissibility and respect for due process at every stage, while preparing contingency steps should results prove inconclusive or require further corroboration through warrants, documentation, and supervisory approval protocols, consistent with Delaware law and precedent governing evidentiary collection practices statewide. Confirmatory testing occurred quietly in early 2017 after discarded material was lawfully obtained. Results established a full match to the steering wheel profile with statistical certainty acceptable for court. Investigators then reconstructed Reed's movements during December 1987, corroborating employment logs, fuel purchases, and witness recollections. His alibi unraveled under documentation. Interviews conducted with procedural care revealed no exculpatory explanation. The evidence suggested Reed encountered Emily Harper after she stopped, exerted brief control, and relocated her body to delay discovery. Arrest warrants were prepared methodically, ensuring the narrative aligned strictly with provable facts. Prosecutors reviewed the file exhaustively, mindful of age, publicity, and burden, before approving charges reflecting homicide by asphyxiation supported by DNA linkage, circumstantial consistency, and expert testimony grounded in contemporary forensic standards, while acknowledging evidentiary limitations inherent to historic investigations, presented transparently to satisfy judicial scrutiny and juror understanding, without embellishment or speculative inference beyond documented proof alone. Thomas Reed was arrested in July 2017 without incident, extradited to Delaware, and arraigned in the county courthouse that had stored Emily's file for decades. Media coverage was restrained, reflecting community maturity and respect for process. Pretrial motions addressed evidence preservation and chain of custody, all resolved in favor of admissibility. At trial, the narrative unfolded clinically, emphasizing timelines, environmental context, and forensic linkage. The jury heard how winter conditions aided concealment and delayed discovery. After deliberation, Reed was convicted of second-degree murder. Sentencing acknowledged age and time elapsed, imposing a substantial term consistent with law. The verdict closed a chapter long open, affirming institutional patience and the value of preserving evidence against time. Families attended quietly, absorbing finality amid winter light, filtering through familiar hallways, where notices once posted now yielded resolution after years defined by absence, rather than certainty and patient trust in lawful process finally justified publicly. In the quiet aftermath, Milford returned to routine, yet the case altered local understanding of time and justice. Emily Harper's name appeared once more in print, now beside words of closure rather than appeal. Her parents issued a brief statement expressing gratitude for diligence without celebration. Law enforcement conducted internal reviews, documenting lessons learned about preservation, communication, and endurance. Cold case units cited the investigation as proof that methodical care can prevail. Winter again framed the town, snow softening edges while records remained sharp. For older residents, the resolution reaffirmed faith in institutions built to outlast individuals, where patience substitutes for haste and accuracy outweighs immediacy. The case entered training materials, reminding investigators to write for the future as well as the present, because evidence endures longer than memory under snowbound years of holidays, silence, and waiting families who rely on records to speak when voices have faded into archives. The solved case settled into history without spectacle. Emily Harper's life, briefly summarized in court, remained larger than the crime that ended it. Delaware's cold case archive reflected a measured success, achieved through lawful persistence. New Year snow fell again years later, covering roads once searched, while courthouse files rested complete. The community moved forward informed, quieter, and resolved to preserve facts against forgetting. In that restraint lay dignity, ensuring the narrative honored process, accountability, and the enduring value of evidence carefully kept through winter seasons. The arrest shocked the community briefly, then reassured it, proving patience and science can reconcile loss with justice without sensationalism, leaving a quiet aftermath defined by closure rather than spectacle as winter passed and records closed, responsibly and finally within lawful outcomes, verifiable proof, and community trust earned across decades of careful investigation by public servants committed to truth through winter, holidays, and time. Following the conviction, attention turned to documenting how the case endured through institutional transitions and changing investigative philosophy. Prosecutors compiled a comprehensive post-trial report explaining evidentiary decisions, ensuring appellate resilience. The defense filed routine appeals citing age of evidence and elapsed time, but courts upheld the verdict, emphasizing chain of custody discipline and lawful collection. These rulings reinforced standards for future prosecutions of historic crimes, clarifying how modern forensic methods may be applied to preserved materials without violating rights. The case thus influenced policy beyond its facts, shaping guidance circulated quietly among regional offices responsible for similar files awaiting review under improved scientific capability. Within Delaware State Police, administrators initiated an after-action review. Detectives who had inherited the file decades apart contributed observations about documentation quality, interview practices, and evidence labeling. The review noted that early investigators avoided conjecture and maintained neutral language, preserving credibility. It also highlighted gaps caused by period limitations, recommending enhanced evidence retention protocols statewide. Training modules incorporated anonymized excerpts from the Harper case to illustrate how small procedural decisions reverberate years later. Emphasis fell on thorough notes, precise timestamps, and cautious conclusions, principles that resonate particularly with veteran officers familiar with long arcs of service and the slow accumulation of accountability. Emily Harper's parents declined extended media appearances, choosing private remembrance. They met briefly with investigators to receive final documentation, including certified copies of verdicts and summaries of appellate outcomes. The exchange was formal and restrained. Officials avoided emotional framing, recognizing dignity in closure without spectacle. Community members expressed relief through letters rather than public gatherings. The town council acknowledged the resolution in meeting minutes, noting cooperation between agencies and citizens across decades. Snow again lined streets during that winter session, echoing conditions at discovery without repeating uncertainty, underscoring the difference between an open question and a resolved record. Local newspapers published retrospective analyses focused on process. Articles described the patient accumulation of facts, the preservation of evidence through multiple storage facilities, and the role of evolving science. Editors avoided dramatization, mindful of audience sensibilities shaped by age and experience. For readers who remembered 1988, the reporting offered continuity, connecting youthful photographs on old flyers with institutional steadiness. Libraries archived the coverage alongside earlier clippings, completing a narrative arc that had spanned generations. The restrained tone mirrored the community's preference for verification over intensity, and for understanding rather than astonishment. The courthouse itself became a silent witness to continuity. File rooms once filled with boxes now contained digital indexes referencing physical evidence maintained under climate control. Clerks updated records to reflect final disposition, ensuring that future inquiries would find clarity rather than ambiguity. Judges cited the case in opinions discussing cold case admissibility, reinforcing that time alone does not diminish probative value when custody is intact. These references entered legal education materials, informing practitioners about balancing fairness with accountability in cases where seasons pass between act and adjudication. Investigators reflected privately on missed opportunities and unavoidable constraints. Winter weather had erased transient evidence in 1988, a reality documented without regret. They acknowledged that public expectations had changed, yet the fundamentals remained unchanged: careful observation, corroboration, and restraint. The Harper case illustrated that diligence can compensate for early limitations if records are preserved faithfully. For seasoned personnel approaching retirement, the resolution validated careers built on incremental progress rather than immediate recognition, reinforcing professional identity centered on service across time rather than headlines. The environmental context received renewed attention in training. Analysts examine how snowfall, darkness, and holiday travel patterns shape opportunity and risk. Maps from 1987 were compared to current infrastructure, noting how development altered isolation. These comparisons informed contemporary patrol strategies during winter holidays, translating historical lessons into preventative planning. The goal was not to relive the past, but to apply its verified lessons. This pragmatic approach appealed to experienced audiences who value continuity between experience and improvement, without rhetorical flourish. Thomas Reed's incarceration proceeded without incident. Correctional records noted compliance and age-related considerations, managed within standard protocols. There were no public statements from him acknowledging guilt. The justice system moved forward without spectacle. The finality rested not in confession, but in proof. For those concerned with institutional integrity, the absence of theatrics affirmed a commitment to procedure over narrative satisfaction. The system functioned as designed, absorbing the case and releasing a judgment supported by evidence and upheld through review. In Milford, daily life continued. The service road where Emily's car was found remained unmarked, its anonymity preserved. Residents passed without pause, aware yet unburdened by unresolved doubt. Seasonal rituals returned. Thanksgiving gatherings included familiar faces. New Year celebrations unfolded quietly, informed by experience. The town's relationship with time matured, recognizing that answers may arrive long after questions are first asked. This understanding fostered patience and respect for records, reinforcing civic trust in institutions tasked with keeping faith across generations. The Cold Case Unit archived the completed file with a closing memorandum summarizing findings, methods, and outcomes. The memo emphasized verifiability and cautioned against extrapolation beyond the record. It recommended periodic audits to ensure closed cases remain accessible for review and study. This administrative care reflected lessons learned from decades of waiting, ensuring that closure does not mean neglect but completion. The archive thus remained a living resource, supporting education and accountability rather than serving merely as storage. As years progressed, the Harper case appeared occasionally in professional conferences addressing historic investigations. Presentations focused on methodology rather than emotion. Speakers outlined how partial DNA profiles can mature into decisive evidence through database growth, and how early neutrality preserves future options. Attendees, many with long careers, recognized familiar challenges. The case affirmed that perseverance aligns with prudence, and that measured documentation can outlast technological gaps. Such forums reinforced shared standards across jurisdictions, contributing to incremental improvements nationwide. Emily Harper's memory settled into family tradition rather than public campaign. Her parents established a small scholarship at a local institution, emphasizing responsibility and community service. The gesture was understated, consistent with their approach throughout the investigation. It redirected attention from loss toward continuity, aligning with values held by many who have witnessed time's passage reshape grief into purpose. The scholarship's announcement appeared briefly in local press, noted without fanfare, then integrated quietly into annual listings. Ultimately, the case's significance lay not in its drama but in its confirmation of process. Winter had concealed facts, and time had tested resolve, yet records endured. The solution emerged from accumulation rather than revelation. For an audience seasoned by experience, the narrative affirmed that justice may proceed without spectacle, relying on patience, documentation, and lawful method. Snow returned each year, covering roads and memories alike, but files remained clear. In that contrast, the Harper case found its meaning, demonstrating that careful stewardship of evidence can reconcile past uncertainty with present accountability, leaving a community informed, steadied, and complete within the quiet bounds of resolved truth. With the case formally closed, agencies turned to long-term stewardship of lessons learned. Internal memoranda emphasized that the Harper investigation succeeded not through sudden insight, but through decades of disciplined maintenance. Supervisors highlighted how early restraint prevented contamination of conclusions, allowing later science to operate within a clean factual framework. This emphasis resonated particularly with senior professionals who understood that investigative credibility is cumulative. Each note written in 1988, each evidence seal initialed and dated, became part of a chain extending far beyond the original officers' careers. The resolution reinforced an ethic already familiar to experienced investigators. Work as though someone else will finish the case long after you are gone. Archival practices received renewed scrutiny. Evidence storage facilities upgraded environmental controls, catalog systems migrated fully to digital redundancy, and audit schedules tightened. The Harper file served as a benchmark during inspections, cited for its completeness relative to its era. Administrators acknowledged that while technology evolves, organizational memory depends on structure. Winter storms, budget cycles, and leadership changes had all passed over the case without erasing it. That endurance became a model for how institutions can outlast individuals while remaining accountable to families and courts alike. Academic interest followed quietly. Criminal justice programs requested permission to review redacted materials for instructional purposes. Faculty emphasized procedural continuity, focusing on how investigative neutrality protects future prosecutorial viability. Students studied the case not as a mystery, but as an example of institutional patience. This framing aligned with a mature understanding of justice as a process measured in years rather than episodes. The Harper case entered syllabi without sensational framing, reinforcing professional values over entertainment, a distinction increasingly valued by practitioners shaped by decades of service. Within Milford, generational memory shifted. Residents who had been middle-aged in 1988 now spoke of the case to grandchildren as an example of perseverance rather than fear. The story lost immediacy but gained perspective. Local history societies archived documents alongside photographs of winter storms, civic meetings, and holiday parades from the era, situating the crime within a broader social context. This integration prevented isolation of the event as an anomaly, instead recognizing it as part of a continuum of community experience shaped by time, weather, and shared responsibility. The physical landscape bore subtle reminders. Route signage had changed, new developments replaced open fields, yet the service road remained largely unchanged. Maintenance crews continued to use it, aware of its history but not defined by it. Law enforcement patrols adjusted seasonal coverage based on accumulated data, acknowledging that isolation and darkness increase vulnerability during holiday periods. These adjustments reflected learning applied forward rather than backward, honoring the case through prevention rather than memorialization. Judicial commentary further solidified the case's role in precedent. Appellate opinions referenced the Harper ruling when addressing arguments about evidentiary age, reinforcing that delay does not equate to prejudice when defendants' rights are preserved. These opinions circulated among prosecutors nationwide, shaping briefing strategies in similar cases. The legal community recognized that the Harper case demonstrated balance, rigorous adherence to constitutional safeguards, alongside unwavering commitment to accountability. For seasoned observers, this balance represented the justice system functioning as intended, even under the strain of time. Media retrospectives marked milestones rather than anniversaries. Coverage focused on procedural clarity, emphasizing how lawful methods produce durable outcomes. Editors avoided language implying redemption or triumph, instead framing the resolution as completion. This approach resonated with older audiences who value understatement. The absence of spectacle underscored seriousness, allowing facts to stand without embellishment. Readers familiar with decades of public discourse recognized restraint as a sign of respect for both victim and process. Law enforcement conferences continued to reference the case when discussing cold weather investigations. Presentations examined how snow cover can obscure transient evidence while preserving longer-term indicators such as vehicle positioning and environmental context. These analyses informed tactical decisions, reminding officers that winter scenes demand particular care. The Harper case thus contributed to practical guidance, transforming loss into instruction without sensationalization. The family's private memorial practices reflected similar restraint. They maintained Emily's grave without public ceremony, favoring personal remembrance. Correspondence with investigators tapered naturally, concluding with mutual acknowledgement of closure. Officials preserved boundaries, understanding that resolution does not erase grief, but alters its shape. This respectful distance reinforced trust, illustrating that institutions can serve families without appropriating their experience for institutional narratives. Financial reviews noted the cumulative cost of decades-long investigations, prompting discussions about resource allocation. Administrators argued that the Harper case justified investment in evidence preservation and cold case units. The cost of storage and review paled against the value of accountability realized years later. This argument found receptive audiences among policymakers attuned to fiscal responsibility and long-term returns, particularly those who understood public service through extended careers rather than election cycles. Training emphasized documentation clarity. Instructors highlighted early reports from 1988 that avoided assumptions, noting how that discipline prevented later contradictions. Officers were encouraged to distinguish observation from interpretation explicitly, ensuring future readers could evaluate facts independently. This practice, reinforced through the Harper example, strengthened institutional rigor. It appealed to experienced professionals who recognize that credibility rests not on confidence, but on accuracy sustained over time. The Cold Case Unit's annual report listed the Harper case among resolved investigations, accompanied by a brief summary emphasizing method. No images accompanied the text. The focus remained on outcome and process rather than narrative flourish. This presentation reflected a broader philosophy that justice need not be dramatized to be meaningful. The resolution stood as fact, complete and verified, without demand for attention beyond its administrative significance. As the years continued, the case receded from daily discourse. It remained accessible in archives, referenced when relevant, otherwise resting complete. This quiet conclusion aligned with the values of those who had followed it for decades. The community did not require ongoing reminders. Knowledge of resolution sufficed. Snow fell, holidays passed, and records remained. For those who had worked the case, retirement brought reflection. Some kept copies of memoranda, reminders of diligence rewarded by time. Others trusted the archive to speak for itself. Conversations among peers acknowledged that many cases never reach such resolution. The Harper outcome thus represented not inevitability but possibility, contingent on care exercised at every stage. Ultimately, the case affirmed that patience, restraint, and documentation can bridge generations. The solution did not rewrite history but clarified it. Emily Harper's death, once an open question, became a closed record supported by evidence and upheld by law. The community absorbed this clarity without celebration. Winter continued to define the landscape, but uncertainty no longer did. The Harper case concluded not with spectacle but with quiet certainty, reflecting a justice system capable of enduring time, weather, and human limitation to deliver accountability grounded in fact. As the Harper case settled into finality, its presence endured in understated ways that reflected the character of the community and the era that shaped it. There were no plaques on the roadside and no annual ceremonies. Instead, closure expressed itself through order restored, records complete, and silence no longer heavy with uncertainty. For those who had followed the case since 1988, especially older residents who remembered winter newsprint and radio updates crackling through cold mornings, the resolution felt less like an ending and more like alignment, facts finally resting where they belonged after years of careful holding. The winter of 2018 arrived much like the winter of 1988, with snow settling along the same roads and courthouse steps icing over at dawn. Yet the emotional landscape was different. There were no missing person flyers curling in grocery store windows, no unanswered questions drifting into holiday gatherings. Thanksgiving passed with families seated around tables without the familiar hesitation of wondering whether justice would ever arrive. New Year's Eve came and went quietly, marked by reflection rather than suspense. Time had moved forward, and the case had moved with it, no longer resisting resolution. Within the Delaware State Police, the Harper file became a reference point rather than a burden. Detectives studying older cases noted how restraint in early reporting preserved flexibility decades later. The absence of forced conclusions in 1988 allowed later investigators to reinterpret evidence without contradiction. This discipline, often overlooked in the pressure of active investigations, proved decisive. It demonstrated that accuracy matters more than speed, and that restraint can be an investigative tool as powerful as any technology developed later. The medical examiner's original autopsy report, once criticized for its limitations, gained renewed respect. Its cautious language avoided speculation and clearly defined what could and could not be determined. That clarity prevented misdirection and preserved credibility in court nearly 30 years later. Experts reviewing the case noted that the report's neutrality allowed modern forensic testimony to supplement rather than correct it. In this way, early professionalism supported later science, a relationship rarely visible but essential in long-term investigations. The legal outcome itself was unremarkable in procedure, which was precisely its strength. Appeals were denied not because of emotion or public pressure, but because the record held. Chain of custody logs were intact. Evidence seals were verified. Warrants were properly obtained. Surveillance complied with constitutional limits. Every step had been documented for a future that no one in 1988 could fully imagine. This foresight was not prophetic but procedural, the result of doing ordinary work carefully. For Thomas Reed, the man convicted, the case ended without public statement or dramatic acknowledgement. The justice system did not seek explanation beyond proof. The absence of confession did not weaken the verdict. Accountability rested on evidence, not narrative satisfaction. This outcome reinforced a principle valued by experienced observers. Justice does not require understanding motive to establish responsibility. Proof, lawfully obtained and clearly presented, is sufficient. Emily Harper's life, once reduced to a photograph on flyers and file covers, was quietly reclaimed by those who knew her. Family members spoke of her not as a victim, but as a daughter, a student, a presence defined by routine kindness rather than tragedy. The scholarship established in her name supported students committed to service, extending her legacy forward without anchoring it to violence. This choice reflected an understanding shaped by years of waiting, that memory does not need constant public display to remain meaningful. The town of Milford absorbed the case into its history with characteristic modesty. Local historians cataloged it alongside storms, elections, and industrial changes, recognizing it as part of a larger civic narrative. The case no longer stood alone as an unresolved wound, but as an example of endurance. This framing allowed the community to acknowledge the past without being defined by it. For an older audience, particularly men who had witnessed decades of social change, the Harper case carried familiar lessons. It affirmed that institutions, when maintained carefully, can outlast individual failures. It demonstrated that patience is not passivity, and that work done quietly often matters most in the long run. Many recognized parallels to their own professions, where effort accumulates invisibly until results appear long after initial labor. Winter remained a constant reference point. Snow had concealed evidence in 1988, slowed searches, and complicated recovery. Decades later, winter framed closure instead of uncertainty. This seasonal symmetry was not poetic but factual, grounding the narrative in physical reality. Weather influenced events without defining outcomes. The system adapted, learned, and endured. The Harper case also underscored the importance of archival integrity. Paper records, once considered fragile, proved resilient when properly maintained. Digital systems enhanced access but depended on the accuracy of original entries. The case validated investment in preservation, reminding administrators that evidence storage is not passive but active stewardship. Without it, science would have had nothing to work with. Law enforcement leadership emphasized this point in public statements and internal communications. They avoided crediting individuals, instead highlighting continuity. The message was clear. No single detective solved the case. It was solved by a system that refused to forget, even when progress seemed impossible. This perspective resonated with professionals who understand that success often belongs to structures rather than personalities. In the years following resolution, no new revelations emerged. There were no documentaries promising hidden truths, no sensational retelling seeking spectacle. The case did not invite reinterpretation because the record was complete. This stability distinguished it from unresolved narratives that remain vulnerable to distortion. Facts, once established, required no embellishment. As time passed, the Harper case gradually shifted from current memory to settled history. It remained accessible but no longer demanded attention. This transition marked true closure. The community did not need reminders to believe in the outcome. Trust had been earned through transparency and consistency. Ultimately, the significance of the Delaware 1988 cold case lay not in shock but in reassurance. It reassured a community that patience has value, that records matter, and that justice, while delayed, is not denied when institutions commit to endurance. It reassured families that their persistence was met with equal resolve. It reassured professionals that their careful work, even when unrewarded in the moment, can matter profoundly in the end. Emily Harper's case concluded not with noise, but with certainty. Snow continued to fall each winter, holidays continued to pass, and life continued forward. The unanswered question that once lingered over the town no longer did. In its place stood a verified record, a lawful conviction, and a quiet understanding shared by those who waited long enough to see the system do what it was designed to do.